Welcome to my new 47-part series detailing why DOS gaming is better. I initially said this as a joke to one of my subscribers and decided, you know what, I'm going to do this. And by this, I mean state that the 90s were better for most people capable of making video games. But that would make for a very short video if I just said that and ended it. So let's start with an analogy instead. If you had a time machine and wanted an expert in medieval combat from Western Europe, logically speaking, the best time to find that individual would most likely be, in Western Europe during the medieval age, when the style of combat was actually happening. And being an expert was kind of important in order to prevent yourself from getting killed, though I suspect appearing in a time machine in front of a knight would be a good way to get yourself killed too. Sounds like a cool idea for a book. I can already sense the arguments coming from the contrarians in the comments section. There's more great game developers now than at any point in history, Lawnie, so your knight analogy is awful, and so was your country in the 90s for that matter. Ignoring the entirely unwarranted attack on my province, I'd say that technically, yes. There are plenty of developers out there because of the ease of access to computers and learning materials when compared to the 90s. But the analogy was about an expert. And when we're talking about the absolute best developers, the ones who are pioneers in their genres or just straight up create new genres, has that number really increased? What I see when I look at the modern gaming industry are people choosing to cover old ground, and in many cases completely ignoring certain less profitable areas. I've talked about the bell curve in the past and how it's only a small portion of the populace that actually innovate, but despite increasing that number of great developers exponentially, all we've found is that there's more of the same type of game instead of greater innovation than ever before. So what gives? Well, it's why I started this video talking about history, because the setting is more important than people realize. My generation is arguably the last featuring a large chunk of it that didn't grow up surrounded by computers and the internet. I wasn't one of those people. I had the internet in the early 90s, thanks to my father's background in computing. But most of the people I knew weren't online, and many didn't even have computers. They were a luxury item and their families couldn't afford them. The world they grew up in was the last vestiges of the pre-World Wide Web world. And those who didn't, who were there in its infancy and spent a lot of time in front of a computer like me, were the exceptions rather than the rule for most of that decade. I remember having to teach my fellow pupils how to use a computer in computing class, because so many of them didn't know how a keyboard worked. Looking further back, I had the privilege of spending time with people from the 19th century, who predated not only the computer and the plane, but were around before my country even had cars. They were vastly different from the people of here and now, because they came from a vastly different place in history. Makes sense, right? Sometimes it's easy to forget just how huge the change was in the 20th century, and that there was a generation who lived through all of it, from the advent of the car all the way to the advent of the World Wide Web. I can't even fathom existing through all of that change and upheaval. Can you? Imagine growing up before television existed and living long enough to see YouTube and Netflix appear. These weren't the people who developed all these great DOS games of the 90s, but the ones who did went through half of that too, and thus also came from a very different time and place than I or any of the preceding generations did. You'll even spot some of these people in my comment sections from time to time. They're very much alive and kicking. When looking back at the top games of the era, the vast majority of great DOS games by these people were developed in the Western world, from countries like France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. We've had decades to explore and discover the back catalogue using our hindsight, and that still holds true, with a clutch of other great translated titles outside of Europe and North America from places like Japan and China. It makes sense, what with those countries in the 90s having access to advanced technology that others just didn't have. Maybe somewhere in the world there's someone who could have been Roberta Williams had they been given a computer, but because they never had that opportunity, they ended up doing something completely different instead. That old thought experiment is largely outdated now, as the playing field has been leveled, and the majority of the world has access to both the internet and computers if they play their cards right. So where has the innovation gone? If someone from the Isle of Tonga gains access to the Unity engine and programs the first Tongan Doom clone ever made and sticks it on Steam, nobody on the internet will care, unless they let them play as Haku, because Doom was already created and copied many times in the early 90s. What's fantastic and new to them has been seen a million times over, so their innovation on a local scale is generic on a global scale. And this isn't a problem that those earlier developers faced. They witnessed the video game boom and crash of the 70s and 80s, so they knew what an Atari and an Apple II were as a point of reference, but the market was still largely untapped. The great mechanical innovators of my father and grandfather's generations had done their bit to make computing a thing, but it was now the time for the creative innovators to step up and show just what the ever-improving platform was capable of. This sounds an awful lot like a case of right place, right time though, rather than any consequence of upbringing. So why am I so adamant that the background of these individuals is more important than their time? Because we're living through another age where tremendous opportunities to innovate exist as a result of evolving hardware. I've talked about it in the past, but the gradual mainstream adoption of VR really is happening, and this allows for a completely new way for players to experience games. Only the things we're being shown are mostly just, here's what you did before in 2 dimensions, but now with 6 degrees of freedom, where VR support is either shoved in like it's just another form of controller, or a nifty fad for someone's game prototype to take advantage of. The crowning achievement in VR's short life and mainstream mass production since the 2010s has been another Half-Life game, using more or less the same style as the 2004 game but with better graphics and worse movement. And games like Blade and Sorcery, which is sorta like Mount and Blade Duels but in VR. It's still seen as a gimmick, something that isn't quite there yet, despite it being developed alongside the PC. If Blade and Sorcery were just a 2D game, nobody would care about it outside of the indies. If Half-Life Alyx controlled like it does with VR on the keyboard, people would be up in arms. That's unfair, Lawnie. The headsets can only do so much right now, and look, VR has existed in some form or other for almost my entire lifetime. The only reason it's not able to do so much is because of the lack of interest, lack of creativity, and lack of risk-taking and lack of innovation. Older developers did more with less. They flourished despite the confines of their hardware, which they coded around in spectacular ways using innovative methods. Now half of all development is spent on mobile gaming instead of pushing these boundaries, and the market has suffered. But what does that have to do with the 90s? Well, I don't know if you've looked out the window lately, but humanity hasn't been doing all that great in the 2020s. There's been a steady decline in living standards, IQ rates, attention spans, and even passion over the last 15 to 20 years. Some would say longer still, and it's been replaced with increased productivity expectations at workplaces, increasingly hostile conditions in general, and a massive increase in mental health issues. And this applies to games companies too, with their staff mismanagement, suspect hiring, and crunch hours. They've been fighting a lot of lawsuits lately too. I could make several videos about these topics alone, and I may yet. All of these things have what I like to call a knock-on effect when it comes to the creative arts, even when you're an independent. Sure, there's the stereotype of the tortured genius who produces a masterpiece despite or because of their afflictions, but for all the opportunities that are being offered with the free tools and courses and networking options that never existed before, the cost of living in this increasingly dystopian-looking future is just too high to stimulate meaningful creativity in many. When one small thing makes it slightly harder for things to flourish, it can be ignored or bypassed. When 100 different small things happen through no fault of your own, it's like you're swimming against a tide, and you question yourself and your abilities. If you grew up in the earlier decades, all these little things would be absent, and consequently you'd be far more likely to flourish. And the worst thing about it? The very people who lived through those decades often lack both the perspective and the hindsight to realize both how good things were back then and how bad things are now. I'm not going to assign blame to them, as it's very difficult to do either of those. I'm also not going to point fingers as to why things are getting worse. I'll leave that to the politicians and philosophers. Whatever caused it, the result is we're cheering when developers and companies don't mess us around, when previously that was the expectation, not the exception. We're cheering when a game comes out that is somewhat comparable to previous high watermarks, rather than being far and away the best thing ever in the genre. Sure, there are a handful of exceptions every few years because of that increase in developers and opportunities, but these are feeling less and less frequent as time passes. As noted by the Wikipedia list of video games considered the best. Look at that drop-off. Ouch. So while it's somewhat galling to admit we're not the best, and the people who were have now aged out of their roles, that's what's happened. The background of these developers, from their birth in first world nations with the technological capabilities to furnish and inspire their ambitions, through to the thousands or even millions of different things that worked in their favour, from external factors like food being better quality and cheaper, to being able to buy a house or rent an apartment or get a job, to more intangible things that are difficult to quantify. It all adds up. So while the convenience and general smoothness of control in modern games has improved markedly from their predecessors, the actual ideas bit hasn't really worked out for some time. And it's not just a matter of time that's caused it, but the unique circumstances of the birth and background of the individuals who pioneered the scene in the first place, that will most likely mean that it will never be reproduced again. Did you like that? There's gonna be 46 more parts, and there's a whole pile of scripted videos on the channel already. Feel free to take a look, and if you like what you see, you can always subscribe. Until next time.